Medieval kings did not solely rely on force to maintain their power. They skillfully employed a range of manipulative strategies to cultivate unwavering loyalty, instill profound fear, and ensure their subjects remained too occupied to mount any meaningful resistance. By expertly controlling the beliefs, fears, and priorities of their subjects, these rulers ensured that few ever questioned their authority. In rural medieval communities, even a hint of questioning the king's authority could provoke immediate and severe repercussions. A peasant who dared to ponder why one man should rule over all might find themselves swiftly struck by a priest's staff, a brutal reminder that such thoughts were not merely unwise but sacrilegious, a direct challenge to the divinely ordained social order. This interaction serves as a stark illustration of the subtle yet effective mechanisms of control employed by medieval kings. The ruler was not simply an individual adorned in elaborate clothing and a crown. He was presented and accepted as God's chosen representative on earth. Throughout the Middle Ages, monarchs meticulously constructed their power structures around the doctrine of the divine right of kings. This clever manipulation elevated ordinary men to positions of seemingly untouchable authority, rendering their decisions effectively beyond question without simultaneously challenging the will of God. Kings consistently reinforced their legitimacy by emphasizing their divinely ordained selection, a notion wholeheartedly endorsed by church officials. Disobedience, therefore, was presented not merely as defiance of the throne, but as an act of rebellion against the heavens themselves. This potent belief functioned as an almost impenetrable shield against rebellion, ensuring that peasants contemplating an uprising feared not only earthly retribution, but also eternal damnation. The effectiveness of this strategy lay in its deceptive simplicity. The vast majority of medieval peasants, deeply religious and largely lacking in formal education, possessed no means of independently verifying these claims of divine selection. The church, holding a monopoly on the promise of salvation, readily reinforced these royal pronouncements in every Sunday sermon. Some particularly cunning monarchs went even further, orchestrating elaborate public displays of miracles to ostensibly prove their heavenly appointment. One king, for instance, allowed commoners to touch his royal robes, claiming they possessed healing properties. During coronation ceremonies, birds might be secretly released at precisely the right moment, creating the appearance that heaven itself was celebrating the coronation. This was not merely theatrical. Kings used their claimed divine mandate to justify military campaigns that resulted in countless deaths, as well as to impose extremely harsh punishments for even the most minor infractions. After all, how could God's chosen representative possibly be in error? What is truly remarkable is the sheer longevity of this deception. It persisted for almost 1,000 years. Generations of Europeans lived and died accepting this fundamental assumption concerning their king's authority. The divine right doctrine remained a pillar of European monarchy until its eventual dismantling during the Enlightenment centuries later. One anecdote tells of a peasant who was imprisoned for 3 months for expressing his doubts about the king's authority. Upon his release, he dedicated years to performing extra religious duties in an attempt to purify himself of these supposedly sinful thoughts. The brilliance of the divine right illusion resided not merely in its ability to ensure peasant obedience, it effectively transformed the oppressed into the unwitting defenders of their own subjugation. Peasants would actively suppress criticism of the crown, fearing divine punishment if they failed to do so. Some even went so far as to report their neighbors for speaking out against the monarch, viewing this act as the fulfillment of a sacred obligation. This manipulation extended beyond basic governance. Court ceremonies themselves were meticulously designed to reinforce the king's uniquely elevated and almost sacred status. The monarch might dine in solitude, observed by others, implying that even his meals held a quasi-religious significance. Royal bedchambers were treated as consecrated spaces with elaborate rituals surrounding the king's waking that mimicked religious ceremonies. One ruler insisted that his feet never touch the bare ground, his body considered too sacred for ordinary earth. Servants would carry special cloths to be placed beneath his feet whenever he moved outdoors. Another demanded that his subjects avert their gaze in his presence, claiming that his divine radiance might blind ordinary mortals. Medieval kings, in effect, orchestrated history's most successful and long-lasting public relations campaign, successfully convincing millions of their subjects that they enjoyed a direct line of communication with God. This manipulation extended even further in rural areas characterized by extremely low literacy rates. Kings would send royal messengers to spread stories of divine visions endorsing the monarchy, tales of angels appearing to ordinary people, warning of eternal damnation for those questioning the king's authority. During times of natural disaster, rather than assuming responsibility for inadequate preparations or responses, kings would deftly shift the blame. These events were declared to be divine punishment for the people's insufficient loyalty. This perverse logic meant that every hardship, rather than diminishing royal authority, actually strengthened it. Some ambitious monarchs even went so far as to claim control over the weather itself, taking credit for periods of fine weather while attributing storms and droughts to the populace's supposed lack of piety and obedience. Kings did not rely exclusively on manipulating spiritual beliefs. They also understood the power of real and manufactured earthly fears. While spiritual terror was a potent tool, it had its limitations. When spiritual threats proved insufficient to maintain total control, rulers discovered that cultivating earthly fears could be equally, if not more, effective. Visualize this scenario. Dawn breaks over a quiet medieval village. Before the roosters have even finished their morning calls, the royal crier appears, frantically ringing his bell in the town square, his face a mask of stark terror. He unfurls a scroll, bearing the king's official seal. "Hear ye, hear ye! By order of His Royal Majesty, our scouts have sighted barbarian forces approaching from the east. All able-bodied men must immediately contribute to bolstering our defenses. The king demands additional resources to ensure our protection." Worried glances are exchanged among the villagers. This is the third such imminent invasion this year, yet not a single barbarian has ever actually appeared. Still, fear spreads like wildfire. Mothers clutch their children. Merchants rush to secure their goods. Medieval kings were masters at conjuring up the specter of external threats to reinforce their control. Whether the threat was posed by Vikings, Mongols, rival kingdoms, or entirely fabricated enemies, nothing united a population behind its ruler quite so effectively as the shared experience of collective terror. The power of this tactic stemmed from the difficulty, if not impossibility, of verifying its claims. The average medieval peasant seldom traveled more than 10 miles from their birthplace in their entire lifetime. Their knowledge of the world beyond their immediate vicinity was entirely filtered through the lens of those authorities they were conditioned to trust. If the king's messenger declared that hordes of barbarians lay in wait just beyond the horizon, who could possibly contradict him? The deployment of manufactured fear served multiple interlocking purposes. Firstly, it provided a rationale for increased resource extraction from an already impoverished population. Villages readily surrendered food reserves, building materials, and precious metals to fund defenses against enemies that frequently existed only in the king's proclamations. One ruler famously warned of an invasion fleet approaching from across the sea. The subsequent emergency defense tax generated sufficient funds to construct 3 new castles, all strategically located on royal lands, far from any coastline vulnerable to attack. When the invasion naturally failed to materialize, the king simply declared that his preparations had successfully deterred the enemy. These convenient royal victories against phantom foes represent an early iteration of resolving problems that never actually existed. Secondly, the carefully cultivated fear served to distract from existing internal problems. When harvests failed or disease ravaged villages, rulers would readily blame foreign saboteurs rather than confront their own governance failures. By channeling anger and resentment towards external enemies, kings cleverly prevented peasants from questioning those truly responsible for their suffering. Archaeological evidence offers compelling insights into this manipulation. Town walls frequently underwent needless expansion and reinforcement during periods when historical records show no genuine military threats. These construction projects functioned as highly visible symbols of the supposed external danger, and also as large-scale public works programs that kept the population occupied, diverting their attention from internal grievances. The more a population feared external threats, the more dependent they became on their ruler for safety, regardless of the threat's validity. Medieval chronicles are filled with descriptions of entire villages performing elaborate ceremonies of gratitude to kings who had supposedly defended them against attacks that never took place. One particularly striking account from a medieval monk details how a rural community spent 15 years constructing extensive defenses against a supposedly savage tribe from the nearby mountains. defenses that were never put to the test because the tribe, of course, was entirely fictitious. Yet, this community annually celebrated their king for preserving their safety from this entirely fabricated threat. Researchers estimate that as much as 20% of medieval castle construction served no practical defensive purpose, functioning primarily as highly visible symbols of both threat and protection. This monumental investment of resources could have been used to substantially improve the living conditions of the common people. The dual strategy of emphasizing divine authority and fostering fear of external threats created a population that was both spiritually and materially dependent upon their rulers. Kings, however, understood that perpetual terror was not a sustainable solution. A more subtle, nuanced approach was often strategically necessary. Medieval rulers understood a crucial truth about human nature. When life consisted almost entirely of backbreaking labor, oppressive taxes, and the ever-present threat of famine, people craved distraction. This is where festivals entered the picture. At first glance, these events might seem to be generous gifts from the crown. Days filled with feasting, music, and games, offering a temporary respite from the harsh realities of daily life. But festivals were, in truth, meticulously planned instruments of control, designed to ensure the peasantry's obedience while simultaneously creating the illusion of reward. This cunning strategy is so effective that variations of it are still widely utilized in many modern workplaces, provide enough enjoyable diversions to prevent individuals from fully acknowledging their level of dissatisfaction. One of the most powerful tools used to keep the population in line was the ample supply of alcohol. Ale flowed freely, often provided by the ruling class itself. Peasants would drink until their worries faded into the background, conveniently forgetting that those same worries would remain after the festival's conclusion. It was a rather simple but highly effective formula. Taxes would confiscate their money, festivals would claim their sobriety, and by the time they sobered up, they would be too depleted of energy to consider any sort of rebellion. Competitions played a vital role in these events. Archery contests, wrestling matches, and games of skill presented commoners with a rare opportunity to display their abilities and, for a brief time, elevate their social standing. The rewards offered were sometimes material prizes. However, more often the reward was simply the intoxicating feeling of victory, a thrill carefully employed to maintain the populace's faith in the existing social structure. If a peasant won a contest and was publicly praised by a local lord, it reinforced the illusion of upward mobility, implying that one's social standing was flexible, determined by skill and merit rather than by mere birthright. Of course, once the festivities were over, that same peasant immediately returned to their customary labor. But for a brief, heady moment, they could believe that they mattered. Entertainment was as essential as food and drink. Minstrels, jesters, and other performers filled the streets, constantly providing distractions through music and comedy. Some jokes even targeted the nobility, though always within carefully defined parameters. A king might tolerate a jester making light of his bad breath, but never of his policies. Mocking the ruler's fashion choices was deemed acceptable. However, satirizing his tax policies constituted a grave act of treason. Tournaments further reinforced the existing social order. While peasants engaged in their more modest drinking competitions and simpler games, knights engaged in impressive displays of martial skill. These events served to reinforce the notion that warfare was a noble pursuit, that knights were heroic figures, and that the feudal system itself was divinely ordained. The reality was that most knights were, in fact, simply well-compensated enforcers for the crown. However, as long as the peasants remained captivated by the spectacle of armored warriors clashing in the arena, they were far less likely to question the nature of the power structure that those same warriors served. Not all festivals were strictly focused on promoting joy and good cheer. Some events served a darker, more calculated purpose. Public executions, presented as forms of entertainment, were not uncommon. A criminal or political dissident, conveniently labeled as such, would be brought before the assembled crowd, and the people were encouraged to cheer as justice was meted out. These events functioned as potent reminders of royal authority, serving as stark warnings to anyone who might consider stepping out of line. This was the medieval equivalent of a public service announcement. Crime does not pay, but witnessing the punishment is entirely free. Kings also understood how to strategically manipulate emotions through carefully timed displays of generosity. If taxes had recently been increased, a festival would be used to mitigate any potential backlash. If a war had gone badly, a lavish celebration might effectively shift attention away from losses and highlight the supposed glorious sacrifice of the people. If the harvest was poor, well, at least there was still plenty of ale to be consumed. These events had a secondary, energy-draining effect. After days of feasting and festivities, the population was too tired, too hungover, or too distracted to contemplate rebellion. By the time they returned to their daily routines, any anger or frustration had been successfully blunted, resulting in a cycle of festivities that repeated year after year, thereby maintaining an illusion of social harmony, at least from the king's point of view. When festivals proved inadequate, rulers had other tools at their disposal. The most reliable and consistent method of maintaining control? Keeping the populace perpetually impoverished. Medieval peasants didn't need to question where their money was going. They knew it was directly into the pockets of the king, the nobility, and anyone else who deemed themselves worthy. The tax system was not only grossly unfair, it was a masterpiece of seemingly unending taxation, carefully designed to ensure that peasants could never truly accumulate sufficient wealth to represent a credible threat. Just when people believed they had paid all that was due, another tax, as if by magic, would appear. This magic trick, astonishingly effective, continues to be employed in modern times. Everything was subject to taxation. Farming the land, using the mill, getting married, and even the simple act of existing. If someone owned a cow, they paid a tax. If they had a chimney, they paid a tax. If they breathed too confidently, they probably paid a tax for that as well. The underlying principle was quite simple. No matter how diligently peasants toiled, they would never amass sufficient wealth to challenge the prevailing system. The truly insidious aspect of this system was the arbitrary and ever-changing nature of the tax regulations. This might be a tax levied for a seemingly legitimate purpose, to fund a war, or perhaps a noble had simply decided that using a specific road should now incur a fee, or it might be imposed for reasons as arbitrary as a change in the king's whim. It was akin to a game with the rules changing every 5 minutes, and the only inevitable result was losing. Wars themselves served as one of the most reliable excuses for imposing additional taxes. If a king wished to invade a neighboring territory, he couldn't simply politely request funds, he had to take them. Therefore, he'd declare a war tax, claiming it was essential for national defense, even if the conflict was long over. After all, what ruler would ever refuse free money? Some war taxes remained in place for generations, long after the initial rationale for their implementation had been forgotten. The church was equally adept at using this system. Tithes, representing 1/10 of a peasant's earnings, were obligatory payments to the church. While ostensibly intended to assist the poor, much of this revenue ended up funding opulent cathedrals and ensuring the comfortable lifestyles of church leaders. It was a brilliantly structured system. Pay now and perhaps receive blessings later. Perhaps. If a peasant somehow managed to avoid these taxes, it was considered a crime. Tax evasion was not merely frowned upon, it could lead to extremely harsh punishments. Lords dispatched tax collectors to enforce payments, and those unable to pay faced brutal consequences. If they were fortunate, they only lost their livestock. If they were less fortunate, they lost their freedom. In medieval times, indebtedness was not merely a financial inconvenience. It was a direct path to lifelong servitude. For those who attempted to evade the system by concealing their earnings, there were always informants. Some rulers actively encouraged people to report their neighbors for tax evasion in exchange for rewards. This ensured that peasants could not even trust each other, as everyone was potentially susceptible to the temptation of betraying a neighbor for personal gain. Forced betrayal represents a particularly effective strategy for keeping a population too occupied with mutual suspicion to unite against their shared problems. One of history's most ludicrous taxes was the window tax. In some regions, people were taxed based on the number of windows in their homes. The reasoning was that more windows implied greater wealth. The result? People began sealing up their windows to avoid paying. If medieval tax policies had persisted, fresh air might have become a luxury item. Even after death, the payments did not cease. Some rulers imposed inheritance taxes, ensuring that families could not even pass down what little they possessed without surrendering a portion to the crown. Dying was not an escape, It was simply another taxable event. This system guaranteed that power remained firmly concentrated in the hands of the ruling class. The nobility lived in luxury, the church maintained its considerable influence, and the peasantry continued to struggle, trapped in a relentless cycle of payments designed to keep them in perpetual survival mode, too preoccupied with work to ever challenge the system. But money alone was not sufficient to ensure complete compliance. The kings needed other tactics. A king could not indefinitely tax his people to the point of utter destitution. This would create serious problems. While a desperate peasant might passively accept suffering, a peasant with nothing left to lose was a far more dangerous proposition. Therefore, medieval rulers mastered the art of simulated generosity. They would lower taxes just enough to inspire gratitude before raising them again, surreptitiously, at a time when people's attention was diverted elsewhere. This profoundly effective strategy is still employed in modern pricing schemes. Artificially inflate the cost of a product, then slightly reduce the price and label it a discount. This process typically began with excessive taxation. The king would declare a state of emergency, often citing war, famine, or some vague national crisis, and dramatically increase taxes to extreme levels. The populace, having no choice, grumbled but paid. Then, when the timing seemed opportune, the king would make a grand announcement. Taxes were being reduced. Suddenly, the same people who had been suffering under the weight of heavy taxation were praising their ruler. This tactic worked almost flawlessly. Take too much, then give back a little, and people will express their gratitude as if a considerable favor had been bestowed upon them. This approach was most effective when people possessed short memories. A ruler could double taxes, wait until the potential for rebellion became apparent, and then mercifully cut them by half. The relieved peasantry, having forgotten that they were still paying more than before, would accept their fate, unaware that they were still paying far more than previously. It was akin to someone stealing 10 coins, returning 3, and expecting gratitude for the magnanimous gesture. The nobility employed similar tactics. Lords would increase the fees peasants owed for using mills, roads, or markets. When the resulting resentment became too intense, they would slightly reduce these fees, presenting themselves as benevolent leaders. The only real change was that the peasants' pockets remained empty, though the pace of their emptying was slowed somewhat. One of the most frequent occasions when kings employed this trick was during wartime. War taxes were introduced, justified by the need to defend the kingdom. People paid because they had no alternative, but long after the war had concluded, the tax would persist. Years later, the king might finally announce a reduction, presenting himself as a generous leader. War, however, wasn't the only pretext. Some rulers introduced temporary taxes that somehow became permanent. The infamous ship tax, meant to fund the navy, remained in place even when no ships needed building. Another example is the bridge tax, intended to pay for the construction of new river crossings. Decades after the bridges were completed, people continued to pay this tax. By this point, they were not funding bridges, but the king's latest castle project. Religious institutions were not above using the same strategy. Churches imposed tithes, claiming they were required to support the poor, maintain religious buildings, and serve the needs of the community. When complaints became too vociferous, they would slightly reduce the tithe and preach gratitude, while their own wealth continued to grow, demonstrating that generosity, when properly managed, could be a highly profitable venture. Some kings even timed their acts of apparent generosity to coincide with critical political junctures. When they required support from their people, they would briefly lower taxes, thereby winning back public favor. Once the crisis passed, taxes would quietly return to their original levels, or even higher. It was an age-old tactic. Be generous when being observed, and be greedy when unnoticed. For those who failed to pay, the consequences were always severe, regardless of the tax rate's level. Failing to meet tax obligations was a crime. A peasant who couldn't pay a debt often lost everything, from land to freedom. Some were forced into servitude while others had their property confiscated, and a few even ended up imprisoned or worse. For something as seemingly minor as failing to hand over a sufficient amount of coins, a person could transition from farmer to convicted criminal virtually overnight. This system of taxation ensured that power remained firmly in the hands of the ruling class. No matter how much money was taken, people were always made to believe that they were receiving a fair deal. The king's generosity was an illusion, meticulously crafted to prevent peasants from fully realizing the extent to which they were being exploited. But taxes and simulated generosity were just part of the strategy. The true key to maintaining power lay in controlling something else entirely. Medieval kings understood that knowledge was power. Therefore, they ensured that it remained firmly in the hands of those who served them. Keeping the peasantry illiterate was not merely a consequence of their difficult lives, it was a deliberate policy. A peasant who could not read could not question, and a peasant who could not question was as harmless as a well-fed pig. Reading and writing were skills reserved for the nobility, the clergy, and a select few officials. Peasants had no access to books, schools, or any genuine opportunity to learn. In some cases, it was even illegal for commoners to receive an education. The reasoning was simple. If people could read, they might start to question why the king possessed so much while they had so little, a question no ruler wanted to hear. Laws were deliberately written in a manner that was incomprehensible to the common folk. Royal decrees were issued in Latin or French, languages spoken only by the upper classes. Even local laws directly affecting peasants were kept deliberately confusing and vague. If someone were accused of breaking the law, they had to rely on a noble or a priest to explain it. And that explanation usually involved the words "pay a fine" or "off to the dungeon with you." Books were not only rare, they were kept under lock and key. Some were literally chained to church walls, ensuring that only priests or high-ranking officials could access them. As books were copied by hand, the printing press having not yet been invented, they were incredibly expensive, placing them beyond the reach of ordinary people. If a peasant somehow did acquire a book, it was likely accidental, and they would probably quickly trade it for something more immediately useful, such as food or firewood. Churches played a crucial role in limiting access to knowledge. As most education originated from religious institutions, priests directly controlled the curriculum, focusing on obedience, morality, and the idea that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next. Peasants were encouraged to accept their place in society and to trust that their hardships were part of a divinely ordained plan. Meanwhile, the priests themselves enjoyed access to extensive libraries filled with books containing ideas that were deemed too dangerous for the common people. Even if someone did manage to learn how to read, there was little they could do with this newfound skill, as writing materials were costly and few books were readily available. Information was transmitted orally, making it easy for rulers to manipulate the narrative. Peasants only knew what their lords and priests wanted them to know, and if the truth was occasionally altered along the way, well, who was going to contradict them? One of the most effective ways of maintaining widespread ignorance was by limiting access to news from other regions. Travel was difficult and time-consuming, and without the ability to read, people were unable to independently acquire information about events in distant lands. If another kingdom overthrew its king or successfully resisted unfair taxation, that information never reached the villages. Kings didn't need to actively suppress rebellious ideas if those ideas never arrived in the first place. Even the nobility needed to be cautious about access to knowledge. A well-educated noble might start to question the king's authority, which could lead to dangerous thoughts. Some rulers restricted education, even among the wealthy, ensuring that only the most loyal subjects had access to books and advanced learning. A noble who read too much might start to think. A noble who thought too much might start to plot. Widespread illiteracy ensured that power remained precisely where the king desired it to be. Village gatherings were not always festive affairs. They were often mandatory oath-taking ceremonies. Peasants would line up one by one to swear unwavering loyalty to their king. These events unfolded with solemn pageantry, royal banners, stern guards, and nervous peasants shuffling forward to place their hands on religious relics. "Repeat after me," a royal official would command. "I swear by all that is holy to serve my king faithfully until death, to obey all commands without question, and to report any treasonous talk I may hear." The manipulative nature of these oath ceremonies stemmed from the fact that most peasants could neither read nor understand the complex legal language employed. They were essentially signing blank contracts with their words, oaths deliberately written with vague, open-ended terms that could be interpreted to suit the king's will at any later date. These medieval kings were essentially getting peasants to sign the world's worst terms of service agreement, except instead of giving away your data, you were giving away your life. Some rural communities underwent these mandatory oath renewals as frequently as 4 times a year. Each ceremony reinforced the king's authority and reminded subjects of their binding promises. Many kings cleverly scheduled these ceremonies to coincide with religious festivals, blending royal and sacred authority in the minds of the participants. The system's insidiousness lay in the severe punishments for breaking these forced oaths. Medieval law codes treated oath-breaking as one of the most serious possible crimes, worse than theft and in some cases even murder. The reasoning was clear. A thief merely stole property, but an oath breaker undermined the entire social order. Archaeological evidence from medieval execution sites reveals that a shockingly high number of people were put to death specifically for violating their oaths. In one excavated burial ground, researchers discovered that roughly 25% of the executed individuals had been convicted of betraying their sworn fealty, making it the second most common capital offense after murder. Penalties for oath-breaking varied regionally, but were universally harsh. Common punishments included public execution, often by hanging or beheading, exile, effectively a death sentence in a world where strangers were deeply mistrusted, confiscation of all property and land, imprisonment in castle dungeons, and even mutilation, such as the amputation of hands that had been raised during the oath-taking ceremony. Medieval kings essentially invented the terms and conditions may change at any time policy, except the penalty for violation wasn't merely losing your account, it was losing your head. Perhaps the most perverse element of this system was its one-sided nature. While peasants faced death for breaking their forced oaths, historical records reveal countless instances of kings flagrantly violating their own coronation oaths with absolutely no consequences. Kings routinely promised to protect their subjects, uphold traditional rights, and rule justly. Then they proceeded to do precisely the opposite. One particularly revealing medieval court document details the execution of a peasant for refusing to participate in a war he had technically pledged to support. During his trial, the peasant pointed out that the king had previously sworn an oath not to wage war without just cause and proper consultation with his people. The judge, however, ruled that determining just cause was the king's sole prerogative, and the peasant was hanged the following day. The psychological impact of these enforced loyalty schemes was profound. Medieval subjects lived with the constant anxiety of potentially violating some aspect of their oaths. This fostered a climate of excessive displays of loyalty, with even minor grievances against the crown being reported to avoid being labeled an oath-breaker. Historians have discovered that many rural communities appointed oath keepers, local officials responsible for reminding people of their sworn obligations and reporting any perceived violations. These individuals effectively became the king's eyes and ears in remote areas, turning neighbors against each other through a system of institutionalized surveillance. The oath system's effectiveness stemmed from its exploitation of deeply ingrained religious beliefs. Swearing on holy relics or sacred texts invoked the fear of divine retribution for broken promises. Kings cleverly positioned themselves not merely as earthly enforcers of oaths, but as representatives of God's will on earth. This coercive loyalty scheme created a perfect trap. Refuse the oath and face immediate punishment, or swear it and live under its ever-present threat. Either way, the king retained control over a population bound by words they often didn't fully grasp but could not escape. Even the most meticulously designed system of control through oaths, however, proved insufficient on occasion. When kings sought to make examples of those who stepped out of line, they turned to an even more sinister approach. Consider this scenario. 2 men stand before the king's court. This was not an isolated incident. It was the system operating as intended. Medieval kings mastered the art of selective punishment, creating 2 distinct legal realities: harsh justice for the powerless and lenient mercy for the powerful. Medieval law codes explicitly outlined different punishments based on social class. In many kingdoms, the penalties for identical crimes vary dramatically depending on the offender's social standing. A survey of 13th century criminal cases shows that nobles convicted of serious crimes paid fines in 85% of instances, while commoners convicted of the same offenses faced corporal punishment or execution in 90% of cases. This was not accidental, it was codified policy. Medieval justice functioned like a restaurant with two menus. The peasant menu, where every dish cost an arm and a leg, sometimes literally, and the noble menu, where everything cost mere pocket change. This system of selective punishment served multiple critical purposes. First, it reinforced the existing social hierarchy by making the consequences of rule-breaking fundamentally different for each class. Nobles learned that they could escape almost any punishment, while peasants learned that even minor transgressions could ruin their lives. Second, it created a powerful incentive for peasants to accept unfair treatment rather than seeking justice. Challenging a noble meant facing a biased court system, and most commoners chose to endure abuse rather than risk even harsher punishment. One of the clearest examples of this manipulation was the medieval forest law system. In many kingdoms, hunting in royal forests was prohibited for commoners but permitted for nobles. A hungry peasant catching a rabbit to feed his family could face execution, while nobles could host lavish hunting parties in the same forests with the king's blessing. Over a 50-year period in a single county, over 400 peasants were executed for violating forest law, while 0 nobles suffered execution for identical offenses. When caught, nobles typically paid minimal fines or received formal warnings. The king's forest was essentially medieval Europe's most lethal petting zoo, at least if you were poor. The absurdity of selective punishment extended to all aspects of life. A nobleman who killed a commoner might pay a small fine, essentially a murder fee, while a commoner who accidentally injured a nobleman could face torture or execution. Medieval law literally assigned a price to human life, with nobles valued at as much as 30 times higher than peasants. Even speech carried different risks depending on social status. Court transcripts reveal instances where peasants were severely punished for disrespectful language, while nobles routinely used the same words without facing any repercussions. The system's effectiveness lay in its openness. Kings didn't conceal this double standard. They presented it as proper and natural. Royal proclamations and church teachings reinforced the message that different social classes deserved different treatment, making injustice appear divinely ordained. The psychological impact was profound. Peasants internalized the belief that they deserved harsh treatment, while nobles came to view leniency as their birthright. This resulted in a society where the oppressed often defended the very system that oppressed them. For medieval kings, justice wasn't blind. It was meticulously calibrated to maintain their power. While forced oaths bound peasants to obedience through sacred promises, selective punishment ensured that breaking those oaths carried consequences only for the powerless and unconnected. But medieval kings understood that controlling people required more than mere punishment. Sometimes the most effective manipulation involved granting peasants the illusion of choice while ensuring the outcome remained predetermined. Have you ever felt like your choices weren't truly choices? Medieval peasants certainly understood that feeling. Imagine a village square filled with anxious peasants. The king's messenger announces, "His Majesty, in his infinite wisdom, will allow you to select your next tax collector. Your choices are the duke's cousin, the baron's son, or the king's nephew." The crowd murmurs with confusion. Is this truly a choice? Medieval kings mastered the art of presenting carefully constructed choices designed to create the illusion of freedom while guaranteeing outcomes predetermined by the crown. This fake choice trick took various forms. Sometimes kings would permit villages to select local officials from a pre-approved list of nobles loyal to the crown. Other times, they would consult with peasant representatives about new laws after those laws had already been written and sealed with the royal stamp. Historical evidence suggests this manipulation was astoundingly effective. Town meeting records reveal peasants vigorously debating these false choices, arguing passionately over which pre-selected noble would rule them or which tax method would drain their resources. One medieval chronicle describes a village spending 3 days in heated debate over which of the king's 2 cousins should become their new lord, unaware that both candidates had already agreed to implement identical policies that would double the village's tribute to the crown. The psychological power of fake choices stems from a simple truth about human nature. Individuals who believe they participated in a decision feel more invested in its outcome, even if their participation was entirely meaningless. Medieval kings brilliantly exploited this principle by providing peasants with the appearance of input without the substance. They created subjects who felt personally responsible for decisions that were already predetermined, resulting in diminished resistance and greater compliance. These kings were effectively running a political magic show where peasants believed they were choosing the card, but the deck was stacked from the outset. One monarch even adopted a systematic approach. When introducing a new tax, royal officials would present three options to village elders: a very high tax, an impossibly high tax, and a moderately high tax. When the elders inevitably selected the reasonable option, they returned to their villages believing they had secured a victory, unaware that the moderate rate was precisely what the king had intended to collect all along. Archaeological discoveries further illuminate this manipulation. Excavations of medieval village meeting halls have uncovered voting tokens and rudimentary ballot boxes, suggesting elaborate performances of democracy in communities that lacked any real political power. These artifacts reveal the lengths to which kings went to maintain the illusion of choice. The fake choice manipulation extended beyond politics to encompass justice and daily life. Accused criminals might be offered the choice between confession, resulting in a lighter sentence, and maintaining their innocence, resulting in torture. A choice designed to extract confessions regardless of guilt. Village disputes were settled by seemingly neutral judges who, quite conveniently, happened to be appointed by and remained loyal to the local lord. This manipulation effectively co-opted natural leaders. Kings would identify influential peasants and grant them minor roles in the decision-making process, cleverly turning potential resistance leaders into unwitting agents of the system that oppressed them. While selective punishment generated fear through unequal justice, the fake choice technique manufactured consent. Together, these two tactics ensured that medieval kings maintained control not merely through force, but through sophisticated psychological manipulation that remains relevant even today. However, even these methods were not always sufficient to prevent new ideas from challenging the established order. Kings required more fundamental means of suppressing dangerous thinking that could lead to real change. Imagine this scene: a peasant nervously stands before the village council, holding a crude wooden model of his invention, a modified plow capable of tilling twice as much land in half the time. Instead of excitement, his innovation is met with suspicious glares and hushed accusations of witchcraft. By nightfall, his workshop has been searched, his prototype destroyed, and his family warned about the dangers of unnatural thinking. This scene was repeated countless times across medieval Europe, highlighting the final and perhaps most fundamental trick that medieval kings used to maintain their grip on power: the systematic suppression of innovation and change. Medieval rulers understood that new ideas could threaten the established order. A society that embraced change might start questioning why kings ruled in the first place. The solution was to create a culture where innovation was not only discouraged, but actively feared. Historical records reveal how thoroughly this anti-innovation mindset was ingrained in medieval society. Court documents show that individuals who introduced new farming techniques, unfamiliar tools, or foreign concepts faced serious accusations, ranging from heresy to witchcraft. One rural inventor who designed an improved water wheel was fined for supposedly interfering with God's established order of labor. The king's philosophy regarding new ideas was simple: if it wasn't done in your grandfather's time, it deserved a lengthy stay in the dungeon. Kings enforced this fear of change through multiple channels. Religious authorities taught that God had already established the proper way of doing everything, and deviation was both sinful and prideful. Legal codes imposed stiff penalties for abandoning traditional methods. Social pressure further marginalized innovators. Neighbors would shun anyone who seemed overly intelligent or innovative. This suppression extended beyond technology to encompass social concepts as well. Perhaps the most telling evidence comes from sumptuary laws, strict regulations controlling what different social classes could wear, eat, and own. These laws went beyond mere displays of wealth. They criminalized any attempt by lower classes to adopt the customs, speech patterns, or knowledge associated with their social superiors. Peasants caught wearing clothes beyond their station could face more severe penalties than those caught stealing food. One remarkable 15th century case details a merchant who was fined an entire year's profit for using certain phrases considered noble speech in public documents. While nobles lauded it as upholding a tradition, peasants experienced it as a draconian dress code violation, with punishments far harsher than mere detention. The psychological impact of this systematic suppression was profound. Medieval communities developed a deep-seated conservatism. People reflexively rejected unfamiliar ideas without consideration. Innovation became associated with danger, punishment, and social ostracism, a connection that perfectly served royal interests. The manipulation's effectiveness lay in its self-perpetuating nature. Kings didn't need to personally suppress every new idea. They had created a culture where communities effectively policed themselves, with ordinary people stifling innovation before it could spread. By framing change itself as the enemy, medieval kings shielded their power from the most significant threat of all, the possibility that people might envision a different way of life. While fake choices controlled present decisions, the fear of change ensured that the future would remain safely under royal control. These 10 manipulative strategies created a system of control far more durable than any castle wall. Medieval kings understood something crucial about power. Controlling what people believe is far more effective than controlling what they do.